Thanks for coming. My name's Kerry Westerbeck, Strongtown's member like you. Thanks for coming. Looks like we've got plenty of seats if anybody else shows up late. Well, I don't want to take too much time, so just want to introduce, is it Charles Marohn Jr.? Chuck is great. There we go. Yeah. So I know we're all here to hear him speak and not me. So without any further ado, welcome Chuck Marohn from Strongtown.
I was getting a little tense there, and then I realized we're on the West Coast. In Minnesota, 12 o'clock means 11:59 start. I realize West Coast is a little bit different, right, John? 12:10, 12:15.
Admittedly so.
I want to respect your lunchtime. Thank you for being here. We have a book coming out on October 1st, and as part of that conversation, we sat down and said, how do we best introduce this to people? How do we best use this event to do what our mission as an organization is, which is to share this message about building strong and resilient places. And we put out a call for places that were interested in having an event. We thought we would get 35 to 40. We're almost to 300 now. And so we're going to be on the road from now until the end of the year. Wasn't planning actually to come to the Pacific Northwest this year. We kind of had everything booked out. And then we had so many requests from here that we said, let's do it before the book is out. So the book actually doesn't come out until October 1st. But we're here, and I'm thrilled that all of you took the time to come out today. If you've seen Strongtown stuff in the past, if you've interacted with our content before, we're hoping that this will be a little bit different. It's a great synopsis of the Strongtown's message, and you can get the book anywhere you buy books, including your very most local of bookstores. I wanted to, and I don't know if there's any way we can hit this light here or not. That'd be really cool. Oh, cool, awesome. One of the authors that I have found the most value in is a guy named Jared Diamond. He wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. He wrote a book called Collapse. Now people are going to fall asleep, Carrie. No, we're good. You're good. Good.
It's better to see.
He wrote a book called The World Before Yesterday, and this was one of the most impactful books for me. In this book, he had a chapter where he talked about the entire book was about what we can learn from primitive civilizations. He spent time living in New Guinea, in Africa, with hunter-gatherer civilizations. And there was one part of this book that really punched me in the gut. He talked about the evolution of human physiology. And he described, and I want you to think about this for a second, what the ideal human physiology would have been for a hunter-gatherer tribe. Think about the way that you would consume food, which was a huge obsession. You would, every now and then, come across a large bunch of food. Some fruit is in season, the fish are starting to run, you come across a big kill, and then you would go a long period of time where you were eating subsistence, roots, nuts, berries, before you came across the next big kill. How would your body have evolved? What would the ideal body type be? Well, think about it. It would be one who would be able to consume large amounts of food all at one time. And in consuming that food, would convert as much of it as possible to body fat. So very slow metabolism. And then between that time and the time of your next big meal, would burn that off really, really, really slowly. In other words, would retain as much of that fat as they could before the next meal. Now, take that physiology, that ideal physiology, the most well-adapted human of the hunter-gatherer era, and put them in modern society. You could consume lots of food all at once. In fact, you would have a genetic urge to do so. When you do that, it would be converted immediately to fat and stored. It would burn off really, really slowly. This is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster.
Cheers.
Cheers, yeah. Well, and it's fascinating because part of the book looked at Polynesian societies where now generations that are just recently converted from hunter-gatherer are seeing obesity rates of 90 and 95%. What Jared Diamond postulates is that when we made the shift from hunter-gatherer to agrarian societies, there were mass die-offs of humans. We had huge problems with diabetes, and large amounts of humans died off because they just weren't able to adapt to a culture of plenty. I start with this because I want us to think about complex adaptive systems. When we look at something like a rainforest, we understand that a rainforest is a complex system. The properties of the rainforest are, as they say in the science, emergent. We have now discussions of rainforests being burned down in the news. This has been a trend that has long happened. People have gone back in and tried to restore rainforests. What happens when they go and try to restore the rainforest? Weeds grow up. You don't get rainforest again. Rainforest is something that emerged. It's something that you can't go out and, like corn, plant and have it come back. It has to grow, evolve, adapt, emerge over time. It's difficult often for us to think of human habitat as complex, adaptive, and emergent. Yet when we look back over history and look at the way humans lived, the way that their habitat evolved along with us, what we see is that the properties of human habitat are also complex, adaptive, and emergent. Complex adaptive systems have four key traits that set them apart from systems that are merely complicated. They emerge from a collection of interacting objects. Each of those objects independently is able to experience feedback, is influenced by other things in the environment independently, and is able to independently adapt and change their own strategy to adapt to those stresses and stimulus. This is where you get the emergent type of properties. A Rube Goldberg system is complicated, but it is not complex. If you stress your watch, your computer, your car, a Rube Goldberg machine, it doesn't evolve and adapt. It doesn't become stronger, healthier. These things are machines that are fragile. And when they're stressed, they break. When they're stressed, they don't emerge new properties. When they're stressed, they stop working. When we look at something like the economy, now we're talking about a complex adaptive system. We're having all this discussion right now about the R word, right? What's the R word? Recession. And if you listen to the Federal Reserve, or you listen to the president, or any of the economic advisors, what are they saying? We're not going to have a recession. Stop talking about recessions. Let's just get that R word off the table. We're not talking about recessions. And why don't they want us talking about recession? Because the economy has a complex adaptive system. The word recession becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we start talking about recession, and when the talk of recession is in the air, what do? Well, I'm not going to make that big investment now. I'm going to save my money and not spend it. I'm not going to go into debt. And what does that happen? That creates the conditions of a recession. And so what you see as like the first line of defense among people who try to boost the economy and the GDP is happy talk, right? You go back to 2008 when the economy is imploding, and what was the Federal Reserve saying? everything's fine, we got everything under control, don't worry, go out and spend. The economy is a complex adaptive system. It has emergent properties. This is why economic forecasting is, in a sense, impossible, because no one is able to really predict the nuances and the changes. The climate is another example of a complex adaptive system. When we look at climate modeling today, one of the frustrations of people who interpret this stuff and try to make policy out of it is that climate models will give you a range of possible outcomes from disaster here to disaster there, but there's not a specific, in 5 years we will be here, in 10 years we will be here. The climate is an adaptive emergent system. Things happen over here that have huge effects over here, and the relationship between them is anything but linear. One of the fascinating characteristics of complex adaptive systems is that when they are given an abundance of resources, they cease to act in complex ways. They become merely complicated. When we look at, for example, a rainforest, and we contrast that with a cornfield, what we see is that a cornfield as a complicated system is again, very good at what it does. But when we plant corn and it gets stressed, there's maybe a little too much sunshine or a little too much rain, we don't evolve into soybeans, right? It doesn't evolve into something else. It stays as corn, and it's either successful as corn or not. It is not able to adapt. We see the same thing when it comes to how we build our cities. When we flood our cities with resources, when we put all our energies into essentially the construction of a one single model over and over and over again, it can be done very efficiently. We can create a lot of growth. We can, in a sense, increase our yields and our output in a very short period of time. But we create systems that are merely complicated and take on the characteristics of complicated systems, including the inability to react to stress, the inability to adapt and change, and the inherent fragile nature. When we look at where this country was at the end of World War II, in the early days of when we started this great suburban experiment that we have been on for the last 70 plus years, what we see is a country that had gone through a huge boom at the beginning of the 19th century, and then a terrible crash and depression, one that no one really understood what caused it, and no one really understood how to get out of it. The whole project of the New Deal was an attempt to try many different things to see what would work. The only thing that really got GDP and growth up to levels that were acceptable was a global war where tens of millions of people died, and we were able to, in the pursuit of all this death and destruction, put lots of Americans to work building bombs and tanks and rationing gasoline and rationing bread and butter, a condition no one would call prosperity, right? There was an abject fear among economists at the time that once all this war spending wound down, once all these, unemployed now young men were demobilized and came back home, that the economy would go right back into depression. There was no structural reason why it would not. And there was abject fear among economists and amongst the highest thinkers in the country that this was inevitable. Of course, that's not what happened, right? We all understand what happened. To solve the most pressing problem of the time, how to not slip back into depression, we created the most robust growth model that any civilization has ever experienced. We created a system to, over and over again, like planting a cornfield, be able to reproduce and recreate a style of growth that propelled our economy to amazing heights. We today nostalgize the 50s and 60s as this great time of American prosperity. In fact, in the last presidential election, what I heard were two 70-year-old candidates looking back in time at what they looked at as the greatest moment of America's history and explaining to us how they could restore that. Whether the vision was blue-collar jobs and Aussie inherit families, or whether the vision was a great society and an expansive role for the social safety net, they were both talking about the same period of time, this boom period a couple decades after World War II. When we look at that cornfield effect, that growth economy, what we see is that we were able to generate with this new model of development, this new experiment we put in place, a whole system of rapid growth. This is Fresno, California. I show this one because we've got really good maps of it, but really I think we all see our cities in this. This is the city limits of Fresno. Here's the Great Depression. Here's the end of World War II. And we all know what happened here, right? Here's Fresno a decade ago. Massive expansion horizontally. Think of the cornfield over and over and over again. Each iteration creating more and more growth, driving our economy higher and higher. Yet, the corollary with this is that with all this growth, with all this expansion, our complex adaptive system started to become complicated. And what we see is that at the very local level, one of the things that was lost was our financial stability. We started to take on all kinds of liabilities along with this growth. This is data from Lafayette, Louisiana. We've had some really good maps there, and we could pull this together, but it's very similar to data that you would collect in any city in North America. At the end of World War II, Lafayette, Louisiana was a little over 33,000 people. Today, it's a little over 120,000, 3.5 times the population. Yet when we look at things like their infrastructure system, we look at their water system. Back at the end of the World War II, you saw 5 feet of pipe per person is what it takes to sustain that city. Today, it's 50 feet per person, a 10 times increase. When we look at fire hydrants, we see a 21.4 times increase. Understand what you're looking at. It takes more and more resources to sustain the same number of people in this new model, growing out and out and out, over and over and over. And we ask the most critical question, what has this done to our overall prosperity? What we see in the city of Lafayette is what we see in places all over the country. When we look at family wealth, we see comparative gains that are very, very small. Since we began this experiment and really accelerating over the last 3 decades, family savings has gone down, family net worth has gone down, debt has gone up. And we find ourselves in a situation where, particularly at the local level, we've experienced lots of growth, but we now have enormous liabilities and lots of instability. My friend John here informed me that this chart was not as informative as maybe I thought it was. So I'm gonna do this a little bit differently. I appreciated that feedback, by the way. This is a chart from my book, and I've chopped it up a little bit. In the book, I hope it's explained a little more clearly. At least my editor thought it was. What I'm modeling here is the cash flow that we experience at the local level from new growth. And this really begins at, for most of us, the end of World War II. That first generation of growth, a lot of what we experienced was the federal government coming in saying, we'll pay 90% of that highway if you, the local government, pay 10. The states coming in saying, we'll pay 90% of that sewer pipe if you pay 10. The Wall Street capital coming in and saying, we'll build that subdivision and finance it on the secondary market. And so what we saw was this huge influx of capital. And when we think about that first generation of new building, all that new growth, all that new capital injected in our communities, the roads were brand new, the pipes were brand new, the sidewalk was brand new, the city hall was brand new, the community center was brand new, all of it was brand new. The stadium was brand new, right? But what happens over time when those bills start to come due? What we step back and see, and we've modeled this over and over and over again, we create this kind of peak illusion of wealth. This is that area of time we nostalgize as being like the peak of American greatness over the last century. But what we see is that when we go out in time, all these liabilities, especially at the local level, especially with our local governments, our local communities, we start to become very stressed because all of these bills start to come due. And with this hyper horizontal pattern of development, this one that doesn't require 5 feet of pipe per person, but requires 50 feet of pipe per person, what we see is that the costs go up exponentially. Our cities today are struggling under the weight of decades and decades and decades of unproductive investment. Now, I show here the first 50 years after World War II. There's a way we solved this problem here. We all know what it was, right? We started to take on debt. Our government started to take on debt. We can look at local governments and we can see that in the 1960s, typical government would pay 1%, 2% of their budget towards debt service. Now we see typically 18%, 20%. I've seen cities where it's 60% plus of the taxes they collect go to paying debt service. But even more important than governments, the people, individuals, families, small businesses started to take on huge amounts of debt. We see all the discussion, and when we see these reported, whether you read Thomas Piketty's book or whether you see some of the things that are being put out in our political conversations, a lot of people point to the mid-early 1970s as being this inflection point where the gap between the rich and the poor started to grow. Our net worth started to change. Wages have stagnated since the mid-70s. Yes, we shifted our economy from one of kinetic growth through savings and investment to kinetic growth through debt accumulation, particularly debt accumulation amongst families and individuals. There are some other important points in this story. I like to point out the pension renegotiation because that is a big issue we're dealing with, particularly here on the West Coast, but really all over the U.S. I think the debt story is interesting because it's created a moral quandary for us today. Yet in the late 70s and early 80s, when a lot of these renegotiations were happening, there's a very simple conversation. We all believe in the growth model. You public employees, will you sacrifice salary today so that we can invest that money in growth and then we can pay you a higher pension when you retire? And the answer was, yes, we'll make that deal. That sounds like a great deal because we all believed in the kinetic growth story. What happens now when that story was false? Who takes the hit? It's a moral quandary as unsolvable as it is, really unblameable. The last thing I want to point out on this one is just our reaction over the last 2 decades when you go off of this chart. Create one housing bubble, create now a second housing bubble. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday in Chelan with some of your planners across Washington State, and we were talking about affordable housing and the fact that Seattle has a price-to-income ratio over 7. When you look at historical terms, price-to-income ratios of 1.5 to 2.5, the price you would pay for a home as a ratio of the income that a family would have is considered stable. We're not up slightly above that, we're way outside that. Culturally, we have no problem looking from 2000 to 2008 and saying housing bubble. That was clearly a housing bubble, like we get that. For some reason, have this very difficult time looking from 2010 to 2019, seeing the same exact trajectory, and we call it a housing recovery. It's a recovery to a mania, right? And really, when we look at our economy today, what we're looking at is the manic phase of this kinetic growth model. I am going to read a little bit from my book here, and then I'm going to invite Angela to come up and chat a little bit. But let me read this little section here about understanding Detroit. It's the very end of chapter 3. I've traveled to hundreds of cities to speak with people about strong towns, and when the subject of Detroit comes up, the conversation nearly always goes the same. If the person I'm speaking with is on the left of the political spectrum, They have a narrative of what happened in Detroit that is internally coherent with their worldview. It was greedy corporations or Wall Street swindlers or a lack of social empathy for the underprivileged. If the person I'm speaking with is on the right of the political spectrum, they have a narrative on Detroit that is also internally coherent with their worldview. It was inept government or the destruction of the family or crony capitalism. While internally coherent, these narratives have no overlap except for one point. We are not Detroit. Nearly everyone I have spoken with sees Detroit as a kind of anomaly, some strange place unlike any other in America, and certainly unlike the place they live. We are not Detroit, and what happened there could never happen here. My narrative of Detroit is different. It starts with acknowledging that prior to the Great Depression, Detroit was one of the greatest cities in the world. It certainly was one of the richest. Even today, it is breathtaking to visit places like the Detroit Opera House, opened in 1922, and realize that it would be stunning even in the wealthiest of European capitals. The amazing buildings still there today speak to Detroit's once tremendous wealth and prestige. In the early 1900s, as Detroit was on its way to becoming the Motor City, it became the first major city in the world to start experimenting with what would become the American development pattern. They were the first to create automobile suburbs, the first to experience people commuting into the city by day, returning home by car at night. They were the first to run major roadways through their neighborhoods. They were the first to tear down buildings and turn over large portions of the public realm for parking. They were the first to transform the human habitat into what we recognize today as the modern North American city. And when society reached the Great Depression and cities around the country started to experience major distress, losing jobs and dislocating populations, there was a cluster of places centered on Detroit that fared comparatively well. So much so that by the end of World War II, it was very clear to a victorious nation what needed to happen if we wanted to keep from sliding back into economic depression. We all needed to copy the success of Detroit. That is what we did. When you take a prosperous and stable city, spread it out at tremendous cost over an enormous area, denuding and bisecting the original fabric as part of the transition, then saddle it with decades of liabilities, you end up with Detroit. Like all bankruptcies, it happens slowly and then all at once. Detroit is not some strange anomaly. It's just early. It's just a couple decades ahead of every place else. My mom actually has read the book, and she called me up after chapter 3 and said, "I'm really depressed." I said, "Keep reading, Mom. It gets better." We're going to take a short break. I'm going to invite Angela Compton to come up and speak a little bit about her experience here in housing and the great work that she's been doing. And then we're going to chat a little bit about some of the ways we can do things differently and bring about a much better, stronger, more prosperous future for our cities. Please. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Come here.
I was told that I was doing something with you.
Come and stand right here. Oh, you were?
Yeah.
Then I will clarify
so
this. I was told that you are very passionate, not only as your day job, but in the evening about housing
Yes.
issues. Can you talk just a little bit about the work that you do? And let's focus on the day, and then let's focus on some of your related passions.
Okay, so my name is Angela Compton. I am from Seattle and have grown up in the region. Coming from a working class, low income family, I've lived kind of all over the Seattle area and have experienced homelessness and housing instability a few different times in my life. Since college, and actually through college, I worked as a social worker, working as a case manager. I've also worked for FutureWise, where there are new executive directors in our audience, that's exciting, working on housing policies. And right now I'm actually at a brand new nonprofit called Housing Connector that is working to kind of bridge the divide between the public and nonprofit spheres and really get everyone working together to increase access to people experiencing homelessness. So I've been there for about 5 months. We're a brand new nonprofit. We haven't even launched yet, but we've already housed over 60 people, so that's really exciting. And so really starting to see some of the private market kind of getting on board with lowering some barriers to housing and letting people in.
Can you talk a little bit about just the specific challenge here? Because I feel like there is the big conversation here about affordable housing and about homelessness as this acute problem. How have you seen it change, and how do your group, what is the model that you think your group can help to actually start to alleviate this problem to a degree?
What do you mean?
Well, talk a little bit about how because I know that you said this is brand new. Maybe what has prompted you to do this work, and how urgent maybe do you feel it is today? Is that different than what we've been experiencing?
Yeah, I think that today there's such a lack of housing for how many people in our region really need housing. That's very obvious. And as that's happening, I think in addition to rents going up, the people who have property are really becoming protective of it. It's a very valuable resource. There's not a lot of housing out there. And in that protection and in really wanting to make sure that they're protecting their assets that are becoming more and more valuable, they're putting in additional restrictions on who they're letting live in these properties. And so one of the things that my nonprofit is doing is working to get some of those restrictions to be lowered. So I'm sure a lot of people in this room have looked for housing recently. One thing that really surprised me when I was looking for housing was how many housing ads I saw that were requiring like a 700 or 750 credit score. And the reason that landlords are requiring that is because they're nervous about risk and potentially like losing out on these assets that are becoming more and more valuable and more rare in our community. And so I think we really need to look at, in addition to just how we can do things right now, how we can change the system in the future in order to make sure that we are allowing for our community to change and to adapt as we need to allow for people to move in and allow for these resources to be available for everyone.
If people wanted to either engage with you or support you or learn more about what you're doing, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I think my volunteer work is definitely a better place to probably engage with me than in my personal life, unless you happen to be a landlord and want to rent to people, then you can talk to me for sure. But my personal life, I do a lot of volunteering with the Resident Action Project, and so we are a statewide organization of residents who live in Washington State and care about really making a difference in housing. We advocate both on the local level and the state level for making change and are really trying to build a movement and get people together and on board with figuring out how we're going to do this and how we're going to really make our communities livable and resilient. And when you look across Washington State, there's so many different kinds of cities and kinds of communities and kinds of housing that we need. And so I think that we're really going to have to really work together and think about like, what do we need in these different local areas, and how do we allow to make sure that they can adapt and change and allow for more growth.
As a last question, if you don't mind me asking, are you from Seattle area?
Yeah.
You are, so this is home.
Mm-hmm.
Does that give a special dimension to your work?
Yeah, I think especially when I think about my parents, this is actually something I shared with somebody from Strong Towns earlier this week. My mom was actually a street kid in Seattle in her teens and then was stably housed in Seattle for 20, 25 years, something along those lines. When I was a little kid, we ended up having to leave Seattle due to some domestic violence issues, and by the time my mom got like our lives back into a stable place and she was still working in Seattle, it was already unaffordable to move back to Seattle. And so the closest I've lived back to Seattle until my adult life was Auburn, and the furthest I've lived away was Wana, which most of you don't even know where that is, but it's out on the Key Peninsula, like 2.5 hours away. And my mom would drive out to Seattle every single day. And even today, my parents live in Parkland, which is in super South Tacoma, and they would both love to live back in Seattle where they've lived for so much of their adult lives, but there's just no feasible way with affordability that they can. And like, we're just seeing that, like as you mentioned, that sprawl and things just being pushed out further and further.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I have personally benefited from over the last 10 years in traveling around as part of Strong Towns, I've been in every state except for Alaska and Hawaii, and these are places that I would not have visited otherwise. And I don't, different than a tourist, I don't go to the attract. I get brought around and get to meet so many people, and I think my pessimism, and certainly the pessimism we leave off at the end of chapter 3, for me, has been diminished by the fact that I've seen so many great people loving their places and doing great work in their place. And so one of the things that we're doing as an organization throughout this whole tour for the rest of the year is highlighting in our content, at our events, in the places we go, the great things that are happening in those places. I know we're in the beginning of what I'm certain is going to be a crazy, acrimonious election cycle where we look across the great unknown divide and see the worst in everybody around us. We want to reflect the opposite back. There's so many beautiful people in small towns, in big cities, in rural areas, in red states and blue states, doing so many beautiful things. It's important for us to take note of them. So thank you for taking the time and being brave enough to come and stand up and do that. I really appreciate the work you're doing. That's a little washed out. I want to get back to this complex adaptive system and have us grow in respect for what I call in the book the spooky wisdom of our ancestors. And by ancestors, I mean this in the broadest, most inclusive sense of the term. Around the world, for thousands of years, in different continents, different cultures, we see a building pattern that was assembled very similarly, assembled incrementally over time. This is my hometown in 1870. This is the very first iteration of my hometown. But when we look at cities all over the world, what we see is that prior to our new experimental way of building, every city started just like this. A series of pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project, or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places would fail. What happens when a place like this fails? Does the stock market crash? Does unemployment skyrocket? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out banks? No. These are small bets. A few people lose a little bit, they salvage what they can, they move on to the next place. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple to understand way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And so after 30 years of incremental growth, that street would become this exact same street here. And after another 40 years of growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and becoming incrementally more intense, the rising land values of a growing and successful place would prompt the natural redevelopment of these 2- and 3-story wood structures to become buildings of brick and granite. What our ancestors understood is that you don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. You don't build wealth by doing massive transformative things, hoping it will then trickle down to real humans. You build wealth by making modest investments over a broad area, over a long, long period of time. I'm going to show you a few case studies to reinforce this point. This is a neighborhood in my hometown. I'd like you to focus on these 2 blocks. These 2 blocks are along the same thoroughfare. They have the same neighborhood. They're the same size, the same shape. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. They're the same cost to the community in a sense. They're the exact same except for the style of development. That block on the left is the original pop-up shack of the 1920s. As my city was growing incrementally out, these 3 blocks were the next increment in the 1920s. And had things continued as they had for thousands of years, we would have seen what? 2nd and 3rd stories, buildings that became more intense, more ornate. Of course, that's not what we saw. We had these built, and then we had the Great Depression, World War II, and then a completely new style of development skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These places have stagnated for almost a century. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. The city had it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-thru. Taco John's, for those of you that don't know, authentic Mexican food delivered to your car window. Did we eat at Taco John's, John? You never have. Taco John's is best known for its potato oles. Tell me who's been to Taco John's, please. Yes. You've experienced this, the greatness of the potato ole? It is a tater tot, like cut in thirds, deep fried, salted, and then dipped in mild cheddar cheese. Exactly like they do in Mexico. So we have a brand new one. It met all of our zoning codes, all of our requirements. Everyone was very happy with this. What nobody bothered to look at was that old and blighted block has a value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, just a different style of development, brand new, only worth $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, this complex way we constructed human habitat for thousands and thousands of years. You're looking at it in its infant phase, after almost a century of decline and neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. This is not an isolated case. We see this all over. This is a big box store, the biggest, most valuable property on the edge of my community. This is a double-sized big box auto dealership gas station, 20 acres. This is the most valuable piece of property. When these people show up at a meeting, we just ask them, like, what do you need, right? This is 20 acres of our core downtown. If you are not familiar with my city of Brainerd, you've not seen the movie Fargo, perhaps, you can see by the map that a lot of our downtown has been torn down, converted into parking lot, burned down, become parking lot. Most of our second and third stories are empty. Our first stories really struggle. This is a place that has had a lot of hardship. We're working at it. It's getting better, but it still is very run down. When we look out at the best of the best on the edge, we see a huge amount of value in one property, $600,000 an acre. But when we shift to the downtown, we see value that's 78% greater. How much did it cost us to get that big box store on the edge? Well, we spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent tens of millions running sewer and water out there. We spent millions on frontage roads, backage roads. How much did that wealth in the core downtown cost us? Well, those were investments my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time, and then bequeathed to us as an endowment of sorts, one that would pay back year after year after year. What happens when that big box store goes out of business? It might be 5 months from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, but at some point, that store will no longer be there. What comes next? I don't know, but we can look around all of our communities and see that whatever comes next in that type of building is lower on the economic food chain than what is there now. It'll be a church, a warehouse, some type of redeveloped use, or it will sit empty. Many of these places, when they're built, have covenants in their deed that says when we abandon it, it must sit empty. You cannot put a competitor in here. And so what we can say with almost certain confidence is that right now, this is the peak. It's never going to become a more valuable property than that. There are 132 different properties in the downtown. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? Or someone outgrows their space, or has to shrink their space? What happens when we figure out that, you know what, we have too much retail, not enough office, or too much office, not enough residential? Well, the amazing thing about this style of building is that it's incredibly flexible. It's very adaptable. These buildings can do many, many things. They can change and flex with the market. They can change with our preferences. They can adapt over time. On the left, you have the cornfield. You have a building style that emphasizes growth, that is really, really good at growing very rapidly, but is fragile, not adaptable, and not financially productive. On the right, you have a development pattern that more resembles human habitat, a development pattern that prioritizes stability over growth, one that emphasizes adaptability and flexibility, and in a word, is strong. These are not isolated cases. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy his group at Urban 3 have modeled thousands of cities across North America, and they see the same pattern over and over and over again. Whenever you have the traditional development pattern, the pre-war development, what we see is financial productivity goes way up. Think of a farmer going and planting seed across a field. And where the field grows up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. So what I'm going to show you right now is where's the most productive part of the city. Where do you get the most bushels per acre? Where do you get the most value per acre? This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York has experienced steady decline since World War II. They have lost population every single year since the end of the war, including last year. Yet when we step back and we say, where in Buffalo, New York is the most productive property, can you point to where the traditional downtown is? Not only is it a repository of wealth, it absolutely dwarfs everything around it. We see the same thing in mid-sized cities. We see the same thing in small towns. This is a little town by where I live. When I first went here, they said, we have some great stuff happening out here, some great stuff happening out here, but these neighborhoods are terrible. We need to get them torn down and redeveloped. And then we showed them where all their wealth is, in those poor neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. I was part of a group invited to go to Lafayette, Louisiana, to help test the value per acre notion. I'll skip to the end of the story and tell you that Joe and I was invited to give a talk at Harvard. Joe is a graduate and met me there. And we found ourselves in the basement going through the library in one of the buildings of old planning manuals from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we would open them up. And again and again and again, we would find one reference, a reference that's not in any modern textbook, that I didn't get in my engineering training, in my graduate school work in planning, that Joe did not get in architecture school or his planning degree. Value per acre, over and over and over again. Our ancestors, and again, in the broadest sense of the term, obsessed over this. It was a measurement of strength and wealth. What you're looking at here in Lafayette goes a step beyond value per acre and actually looks at profitability. What are the parcels that generate more in revenue than they require in ongoing expense? Everywhere where you see blue is a parcel that is, in a sense, profitable. Everywhere where you see red is a parcel that is the opposite. It costs more to provide the ongoing service than it generates in revenue. We looked at all revenue sources, property tax, sales tax, utility fees. We looked at all expenses, all the infrastructure maintenance, all the transit service, police and fire protection, everything. What you're looking at here is the core downtown and the poorest neighborhoods in the community being the profitable places, the places that are generating excess revenue. And everything out here in the red, are the big box stores, the malls, the franchise restaurants, the curvy cul-de-sacs, intensely negative. This is what that red stuff looks like. Stuff that we see all over, that we know that it's part of that cornfield pattern of development, right? And then here is the rainforest. Look at that neighborhood on the bottom. That is a highly profitable neighborhood. And just so we're all on the same page, the city's not maintaining any of this stuff. They're doing a horrible job of maintaining it. Our calculations assume it was all maintained. So even if the city were to go out and maintain these streets and keep the street lights running and do all the stuff that you would assume they would do, they're still making a killing in these poor neighborhoods. I often have people say, well, how is this possible, Chuck? And my initial answer is dissatisfying. I don't know. I think it defies simple explanation. Why is that old and blighted block more productive than the shiny and new? I think as an engineer, I can point to certain things, but what we're really looking at is the spooky wisdom of this evolved habitat that addresses many, many competing things all at once. Let me point out two that I'm aware of. And I say this because there's new things pointed out to me every day about this development pattern that I had no clue even existed. One of the things that we discovered here was that in this blue neighborhood, a lot of the people's sewage, when it runs out of their house, runs into a pipe and drains down to a lift pump where it's pumped out to the sewage treatment plant. A lot of the houses out here, when it would do the same thing, the sewage would run out of the house, down in a pipe, to a lift pump, and then would be pumped 20 times in succession in different pumps to get to the treatment facility. They both pay the same exact bill because they're both a single house, a single payer. One place obviously has way greater costs, but the revenue is the same. I'll give you another example. I think my next slide, yeah. Well, I'll show you. If you are a very poor person and you are going out to build a city, you're going to build a street, and you're going to live on a street with a bunch of other people on that same street. And you understand, because this is wisdom handed down to you for the generations, you understand that the wealth that all of you on this street create is going to have to be enough to not only do your share of the other things in the city, but to actually maintain your street. Like that's like the minimum threshold to exist. If you're poor, how do you build your house? You build your house narrow and deep. You build your house narrow and deep because now you can share that burden with a whole bunch more people on your street. This is the 5 feet of pipe per person as opposed to the 50. Now, what if you're in the illusion of wealth? You have this big growth phase. You're not really cared about expenses. Your system has shifted from complex to complicated, and all you're interested in is mass production. Build more corn, corn, corn. What do? You take that skinny house and you just flip it sideways. You build shallow and wide. The level of gluttony involved in a development pattern that consumes resources like this, as opposed to this, is just unfathomable. And I've struggled for many years to explain why, particularly when I come out here on the West Coast, where almost all of the development pattern is post-World War II. Why it's physically jarring to me to see the level of waste in every little increment of what we build. We obsess over plastic bottles and straws, and I get that. I'm not trying to belittle that. But understand that you're looking at millions and millions of dollars in each subdivision that we just throw away for a little bit of extra space in a berm here and a little bit of useless space over there. It's absolutely jarring. Leon Creer, one of the great architects of modern times, has an explanation for how to shift from this manifestation of kinetic growth at the local level to something that would be more akin to a stable development pattern. He draws a simple drawing of the mature city and then suggests how would a mature city grow. One model is our hyperkinetic model, which he calls vertical and horizontal overexpansion. But another model is almost too simple to even put into words, and that's why I love this image. It is a model of expansion through duplication. Here's the astounding thing about our cities. Everyone in almost every city can go to the parts of the city that are, on one hand, financially productive, and on another hand, are wonderful places to be. Let's copy those. It's not like weird aliens live in these places. Humans occupy them. Humans have occupied places like that for a long, long time. These are wonderful places to live. Let's just go build more of them. And I think as like an overlaying construct, when we look at organizations like the Congress of New Urbanism, which was here a couple years ago, I was here with that group when they were here. Their simple message is, hey, this worked. Let's not give it up. Let's continue to do this pattern that worked. So how do we start to adapt today to a system that would get us to that? You just gave me a hand wave.
5 minutes.
Am I done in 5 minutes?
No, that'd be 1 hour from when you started.
Was I supposed to be done in 5 minutes?
We can go over those.
Am I going to get kicked out?
No.
Okay, then I won't be done in 5 minutes. But
Let
let me put this: if you have to leave, I'm a Minnesotan. We would consider that rude to get up and walk out in the middle of church. That being said, I fully understand that if I've abused your time by going over the allotted time and you have to get up and leave, I will take zero offense. Okay? Let me go quick through this then. I feel like this is the most important part for you, though, here. The idea of allowing the next increment by right. We have a saying that at Strong Towns, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood should be exempt from change. Oftentimes, our development model today, it is because it is top-down, because it is centralized, because it relies on government approvals and Wall Street funding, we tend to only be able to move in very large increments. And so you see neighborhoods stagnate for long, long periods of time, and then all of a sudden be flooded with capital. And overnight change from single-family homes or modest dwellings into condo units and other things. And we have cries of gentrification, we have cries of displacement, and rightly so. This is a development model that does not respect humans and human habitat. The idea that neighborhoods should be protected from this is quite rational. And it's where I run into quarrels with the YIMBY crowd at times, because I do think that it's a rational human response to say, no, I do not want this radical transformation. But what is not rational is to then also deny that human habitat, organic natural systems, should never change or evolve over time. Inherent in them is the notion that they would evolve and adapt and become something new. We have to allow every neighborhood to grow. We do this, one of the important things is lowering the bar of entry. For very compassionate reasons, we have raised the bar of expectation. And oftentimes, particularly here in a city like Seattle, or in a lot of our West Coast places, we raise the bar to entry because we're compassionate. We have a minimum standard we want to meet. And then we turn around and we say, everybody who can't meet that standard, we'll provide some assistance for you to live at this level. But what happens when you raise the bar of entry is you say, here's the ante to play the game. And the game is this wealth building game, this prosperity game. Wendell Berry has a lot of statements about the fact that if you don't allow people to subsistence farm, you're denying them a path towards independence. And what that is a realization of is that in the traditional development pattern, when you could start with a pop-up shack, you could literally start with nothing. And by your hard work and the collective actions of a neighborhood and a community, build up to something. When we raise the bar of entry, we take that away. This is often called a little house. And we have specific ordinances about little houses, where they can be built, what process you have to go through to build a little house. In the past, this would have been called a house. People often started very small. As they would accumulate a little bit of money, they would add on. As they would get a bonus at work or had a second kid, they would build a little addition. Maybe the neighbor would come over and help. You could go help them. I'm gonna give you a mechanism that was very, very common. First of all, there was never such a thing as a single-family home. Single family, it was. If we go back in time and we look at hotels were very. There weren't very many hotels. There were some. They were gorgeous. They were beautiful. But the idea of like Airbnb as like this radical thing today, that was just what everybody did. Everybody rented out rooms. It was very, very common to have just a little sign out front, say room for rent, and then you bring it in when someone rented it for the night, and they would sleep in the one extra bedroom you had for whatever reason, and you would feed them breakfast, and they'd give you a couple bucks, and then they'd leave. That was like extremely common. That happened all the time. And think about it for a minute. I'll give you this example that I've heard repeated a few times. Think of a family that had a house where the roof went bad. And you need to fix the roof because if the roof leaks, it's going to destroy your entire investment. But they're human. Money is tight. They don't have the money to fix the roof. What do? Well, you go to the bank and get a loan, but they can't repay the loan because they don't have the cash flow. Well, what do? They go to the bank, they get a loan to fix the roof, and at the same time they get a loan to do an addition on the back and convert part of the back into a rental apartment. And then they rent that out and they use that revenue to pay back the loan. Now they have a roof that's fixed and a rental property. Now they have income. They've been able to stay in their house. They've been able to add to their equity, generate wealth. You can't do that today. We've denied that. You're in a single family home, you'll always be in a single family home. Don't you dare change it. We have to allow our neighborhoods to adapt and evolve. And if we want to be compassionate to people, we have to give them the agency to be able to do those things. This is Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon had a downtown with a lot of vacancies. When they studied it, they found out that their entrepreneurs could not fill those vacancies. The buildings required sprinklers and too much capital up front, or they were too big. And they had a lot of entrepreneurs that had no place to go. And what Muskegon did is they went out and bought a bunch of storage sheds. They filled a gap they had in their streetscape with storage sheds. And then they rented them out very, very cheaply to these young startup entrepreneurs. Not all of them were young, although the ones I ran into were very young and feisty. Guess what the effect was? Not only did you get all that entrepreneurial energy off the sidelines, and oh, by the way, I'm just going to make a broad statement. Often we think of poor people as being not entrepreneurial, not bootstrapping. The most entrepreneurial people in the country tend to be the most poor people because they have to bootstrap every single day. What they did is they created room for people with nothing to take their crazy idea and get started. You go to their downtown now today, those shops are all full. And a lot of the building that's happened there, a lot of those full shops, are people who graduated from this once they proved their business model and could then access the capital markets of the higher bar. Now they're in the downtown. We have to lower the bar to entry. As a final thought then, we have to change our investment model to actually respond to how people use our places. We have, let me dwell on this just for a second. One of my favorite Twitter accounts of all time was Stuck Bertha. I don't know how many of you followed Stuck Bertha, but I had Stuck Bertha on, what's it called when you have it where it texts you when they, so I would get an alert every time Stuck Bertha had a notification, and I'm like, this is the most hilarious Twitter thing ever. You all embarked on this massive, huge project here. And you've done a number of these massive, huge projects. And the idea was, let's take large amounts of capital and let's invest it in one like transformative thing under the guise that would create prosperity and would kind of trickle down, and then all the gaps would be filled in over time. And what we have found, and I think we all intuitively understand this, but we can mathematically show this too, is that these are really very poor investments. They're often negative returning investments. But even when they're not, the ROI is very, very low. We have done this for decades and decades and decades, and we now have an urgency to spend a decade or two or more doing the hard work of filling in those gaps, of making good use of what we've already built, of thickening up our places and making them more productive. And the way we start doing that is to actually observe how people are using the stuff we have built. When you go out and look at the landscape we have created, and you look at it with a humble eye, what you see is that there is an endless number of small investments that need to be made that we really have no mechanism for making today. And so what we have recommended to local governments, to groups that are out doing this work, is a 4-step process to identify the investments that we should be prioritizing over all others. The first step in this process is to go out and humbly observe where people struggle. Go out to the neighborhood, and with humility, and I emphasize humility as a word to say, clear your mind of what you think you know the problem is, what you think you know the solution is, and literally walk with people in the neighborhood. Have them narrate to you their experience, have them describe to you what their day is, identify their struggles. Step number 2, ask a simple question. What is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the huge transformative project that will solve this forever. Not what is the big thing I've always wanted in the city. But what is the next smallest thing we can do right now? The third step then is to do that thing. Do it right now. Don't form a committee. Don't study it for 6 months. Don't go apply for a grant from Washington, D.C. Just go do it. And then the fourth step is to repeat that process again and again and again. Jane Jacobs describes cities as a collaborative endeavor. Our cultural language in this kinetic growth model, this cornfield type of development pattern, has evolved to take on this really pernicious aspect of customer service. You are all customers now of a city. You pay your taxes, and you should expect a service. And internal to city government, we've started to talk about this. How's our customer service? Are we serving you well? Jane Jacobs described this co-creation model. The idea that government as servants and humans, residents, citizens, as co-creators, working together to build a place. This is how we fill in the gaps. This is how we increase our productivity. This is how a city of any size with any amount of wealth makes fundamentally sound investments that will improve people's lives. I'm going to end with 2 photos. I was in Lawton, Oklahoma a few years ago. And you can see, it's a little washed out here, but you can see they did the big transformative project. They had a struggling neighborhood, and they looked at it as a nail. They took out their hammer. They went to Washington, D.C. They got a Tiger grant to put in the blinged out sidewalks, the stone crosswalks. They put in the decorative lights, and nothing happened. Because they started with their solution, not with the struggles of people. As an alternative model, here's a little block in Memphis, Tennessee, another city that has deep, deep struggles, yet a city with an overwhelming amount of just cultural energy for positive change. And we see these kind of things happening in Memphis all the time, where individuals and neighborhoods take it upon themselves to go out and make their place just a little bit better. This one was just a little kind of better block project where they swept things up and cleaned things up, put in some crosswalks and some bike lanes. Cities documented massive, massive amounts of improvement from just this little thickening up. $15 million of new investment. These projects are sitting out there waiting for us to notice them. And if we can humble ourselves to observe where people struggle, if we can discipline ourselves to work in small increments, not only can we make amazingly productive investments that will return many, many dollars for every dollar we put into play, but we cannot help but improve people's lives in the process. And that's the essential nature of the Strong Towns approach. Thank you all for giving me the time.
No, please.
Go ahead. I know that part of they've sent John here is with me from our office, John Pattison. Part of what they've sent him here to do is to force me to sit down and sign book things. I left them in the car. I can't even do it.
We can still sell them. They just wouldn't have the book.
Yeah. So if you want to get a book and you want to get one from John, we will send it to you signed and autographed if you want to get one here today. John's got all the stuff to make that happen, and I have a left hand I can write with. And when we get them finally, we will send it to you. Otherwise, do go buy it. I know there's some awesome local bookstores here. They will all carry it. Go get it. Or you can get it anywhere else. Carrie, thank you so much for helping make this happen.
And I also have to thank Hugh Enan, sitting around here somewhere. He co-produces this. He did a ton of work to make this all happen. So thank you. He's just not up here. So I wanted to ask if you want to take a few minutes. We probably don't need to leave for about 5 more minutes. I don't know if you want
I tell you
to
what,
questions.
I wish we could just do Q&A and not do any talk.
We
So
can also
please,
do that in the lobby, and then we wouldn't have to leave the city.
I would love. Let's do a few, and then we can move down there.
Okay.
And I think we have to leave at like 1:30 or 1:45.
yeah.
Okay, please.
So, Chuck, challenge here in Seattle, you mentioned Bertha. That was a state DOT project.
Right.
Obviously, it was a long time Seattle road, but can you speak to the challenges or give voice to the challenges of areas where you have external really markets, especially the financial side, moving into what used to be those incremental levels. We've had the single family homes that have been bought up and are now rentals.
Right.
Then you get so-called professional management, I say that as a real estate manager, that put things like you need a certain credit score to rent what is really entry-level housing.
Yeah.
I mean, those are factors beyond, in many ways, local control.
Right. I feel like there's two layers of this, and I feel like one layer is your layer, which is kind of like the block level, neighborhood level, beautiful, nurturing. How do we deal with this today? There's another layer of this that is the crazy layer, and let me try to address that one, because yesterday I got hit in Chelan with the planners from the state. So technical people asking me very similar questions to this. And I answered it many times in different ways. And I think we only made a breakthrough when I talked about some of these macro trends. So let me just very briefly do this. There's a Czech economist named Tomáš Sedlacek, who I feel like has described this phenomena better than anyone. And I'm going to borrow his language here. He describes our economy not as one where we go through cycles of depression and recovery, but one where we go through cycles of depression and mania. He describes our economy not as depressed, but as manic depressed. Mm-hmm. And if you start to think of our economy in that way, a lot of what we're facing makes a lot more sense. In 2008, 2009, we went through depression. And our urgency there was to say, restore us to mania. Restore us to a manic phase. If you look at the symptoms of the bipolar disorder, of a manic depressant, what you see is that the depression phase is a depression phase, and we understand how to treat those. You bring the mood back up. But if you don't treat the manic phase is where, yes, you're very artistic and productive, and you can work for 4 days straight and do beautiful things. But it's also where people, jump off bridges because they think they can fly, and they do all kinds of insane. You overspend. You have no sense of what comes tomorrow. You're manic. When I look at a 7+ price to income ratio here in Seattle, and people say, "Well, help us solve our affordable housing problem," to me, it's a mania problem. And what happens at manias is that they end, and then you go back into depression. And so what really ultimately needs to happen, the way you treat a manic depressive is you raise their depression, but you also mood stabilize their mania. And that's what we're incapable of doing. Our local governments are dependent on mania to make their budgets. Our Wall Street portfolios are insistent on mania in order to meet their targets and objectives. The capital we get in is fueled by a mania. And so part of the approach that we're recommending of these incremental steps is really what the Federal Reserve is designed to do. It's really what the ECB is designed to do, which you've heard this term if you've heard any economics. The role of the Fed is to take away the punch bowl before the party gets too crazy. And that is because the Fed is supposed to be the mood stabilizer. But we don't have mood stabilizers at all now. We have an obsession with this kinetic growth model. We must experience it or everything goes bad. And so your question, I think, is very good, and it's insightful. I don't have an answer beyond, I think we have to have beautiful people deal with the symptoms, because the symptoms are acute and real people are getting hurt. And then I think as a local project, we need to start building alternative models so that when the mania ends and we go through the depression and the talk is bring us back to mania, please restore us to our manic state, we have an alternative model that we can point to and say, look, this neighborhood has experienced a more stable pattern. It's better, it's more successful, it's more humane, let's do this. I feel like strong towns will never overcome our manic desire. We can only be the alternative when we're burnt out with mania. And my God, Seattle needs to be burnt out with mania. I talked to one of your planners yesterday, and he said, and we use this analogy of a boat that is dependent on favorable winds as being a horrible boat. But we have built an economy that is dependent on favorable winds. If the wind dies, everything goes bad. That's a very fragile model. That's the cornfield model. He said, in Seattle, we have more wind than we can handle. And I'm like, yeah, you're living in mania. And there's no there's no rational way to deal with mania except to, in a sense, opt out and start building alternate systems for once that's over. So I'm sorry that I don't have an easy answer for that. Should we shift down to the downstairs? Or are we good?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, the room is going to be used as one for, yes.
Okay, so let's be polite. I will be happy to spend another 15, 20 minutes down there, and I would love to chat with everybody. And if you would like a book, come see John. He'll take care of it.
Before we totally break, I was hoping to do this before you all got started, and but I was late. But if no one has welcomed you all to